Hey there, this is Aiden Feldman, and today we're going to be looking at using promises in JavaScript. So suppose you're making a simple AJAX request using jQuery. Here I am fetching example.json, and when that data comes back, I will print out the message. So to do this same thing with promises looks very similar, but instead of passing a callback directly to the get method of jQuery, we instead have this promise object that's returned. So rather than a callback needing to be passed to the original method, we can instead pass around this object that basically stands in place of the result. So this could be within some other function of, get my data. And if the promise is returned, anywhere that we have access to that promise, we can then attach new callbacks by using this then keyword. So with then, we pass in our callback and we get the data out just as we normally would. Now where promises start to get a little more interesting is if you are combining multiple asynchronous operations. So let's look at a simple example of doing two AJAX requests that are dependent on one another. So the first gets example.json and returns data 1. So our second request relies on that data, so we have to pass in the value as a query parameter here. So the second AJAX request will not actually be able to start until the first completes. When they both are done, I print out both are fetched. If we look at the same example converted to promises, we can see that I'm making the first request, but then when that first request is done, I make the second request, but instead of attaching the callback, I'm instead returning that value. And we already saw from the first slide that $.get returns a promise. So if you return a promise within a callback of another promise, you can then attach a callback to the final result, which is when both of those promises finish. So just to expand that out a bit, the first request gives back a promise. When we say promise1.then, we initiate the second AJAX request, which gives us promise2. If we return promise2 from within the then call of promise1, we get a promise which encompasses both of these requests. So when promise all is done, we know that both things have been fetched. As another example, if you want to complete multiple AJAX requests in parallel, you might do something like this. You make the first request and store it in a variable. The second request, you also store its promise in a variable. And then jQuery has this convenient $.when method. $.when takes multiple promises, which give back a new promise, and that promise will then be fulfilled when both of the promises provided complete. So one other example of where promises become really convenient is in error handling. So normally, if we look back at our serial callback example, if our first AJAX request had a problem, we'd have to do something special to bail out of this latter request and not actually do it. Similarly, if a problem happened in our second request, we'd have to indicate to whatever called the first request that there was a problem. The awesome thing with promises is that you can do the error handling in one place. So let's suppose I first make a request to some non-existent endpoint, but maybe I don't know that at the time. I'm then doing my serial request, so making another request if that first request finishes successfully. At the bottom, I have my then and my first callback, like I did in the original example. But the then method actually is able to take a second callback, which is if that promise provided failed. So this failure callback will actually be executed if any of the previous promises that were combined into this final one fail. So here you could make a bunch of AJAX requests and not need to do separate error handling every time. This is super convenient. So everything I've been showing is using jQuery. jQuery has a built-in notion of promises, although promise purists aren't too happy with the jQuery version because it acts in slightly different ways than the spec specifies. So if you're using jQuery just for simple things, the built-in promises are fine. If not, I recommend using a other library like Q or Bluebird. The other cool thing is that promise support is coming to all major browsers, and it's really out there in almost everything but IE. So that means you can actually use promises for your asynchronous operations in whatever browser and just pull in some library as a polyfill to work for IE. So that's it. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and hope to see you using promises.